on the ground in Puerto Rico.
Yeah, we're showing some video. The president was at a meeting with a group of Puerto Ricans, and he was distributing some supplies, throwing out some paper towels to the folks there. Jeff Zeleny, what stood out to you?
I think that's going to be one of the enduring images there, the piece of the video of the president throwing out a roll of paper towels there. But look, he was definitely trying to create his own reality on the ground. But the problem is, as he arrives back in Washington this evening, the reality as it exists remains the same there. So he will still be judged by how the island recovers. And of course, Puerto Rico had many, many challenges before him, no question about that, but it is still happening on his watch here. So I thought it was he was so in search of a good narrative, a good story here. The reality is we're going to keep reporting, even Republicans in Puerto Rico, and we should point out they can vote in primaries, so there are Republican delegates and things, even they are crying out for help here and saying the response is not adequate. So he cut his trip by an hour short. He was on the ground, I think, 4.5 hours or so, our Sarah Murray said, and she made the point that's shorter than it takes some people to wait in line for gas.
Caitlin Collins, what was your reaction?
Well, I don't think there's anything wrong with praising federal agencies when they're doing a good job, and I think most people would argue that they've been more competent in Texas and Florida than the Bush administration was in Louisiana. But when congratulating the government becomes the primary focus instead of the suffering of people who are there, that's when it becomes this strange path. And then comparing the death toll numbers from Hurricane Maria to Hurricane Katrina is also a little off because we A, don't know the death toll in Puerto Rico. They haven't been able to get in touch with a lot of people. And B, to say that this is not a catastrophe like Katrina is simply not true because 90% of the island doesn't have power. 50% of them don't have clean drinking water. Over 9,000 people are in shelters. So this is the definition of a catastrophe, but it seems like the president is focusing more on the government's performance than the suffering of people who are affected by this.
And you heard the mayor of San Juan, as you know, was in a battle with the president over the weekend. When she spoke to our Leila Santiago after she had the interaction with the president, she was pretty clear. She was like, there was a whole PR component to this trip, as Jeff is saying, in search of a narrative. But then she said when she met with all the agency heads and they got down to business about the money they need and the specific asks that she had, she thought that was a very productive session. So I don't think this trip was for naught. I just think that
but also the president stop the blame game, start making the situation better. That's your job.
All right, tough words from the Senate Minority Leader, Chuck Schumer. Charles Hurt, did President Trump's visit to Puerto Rico accomplish what he could have wanted it to accomplish?
I think so, and I think also the politics of Puerto Rico, that obviously Democrats are trying to gin this up a little bit over the last couple of days. I think that it is obviously going to be somewhat subsided based on what has happened out in Las Vegas. But I thought that was an interesting thing that for Schumer to complain about. I took Trump's kind of funny remark about looking around at the officials in Puerto Rico saying that you've really thrown our budget out of whack. I took that to mean he was talking about all of the spending crises that existed before the hurricane hit. And it is a real issue, and it is something we're going to have to talk about.
It's perhaps a question of timing, whether this is the message they need right now, but let's play the soundbite from President Trump about which Senator Schumer was complaining.
Mick Mulvaney is here, right there, and Mick is in charge of a thing called budget. Now, I hate to tell you, Puerto Rico, but you've thrown our budget a little out of whack because we've spent a lot of money on Puerto Rico, and that's fine. We've saved a lot of lives.
Mara, is it the case that when there's a natural disaster of this kind of severity, no matter who the Republican president would be at that time, the Democrats are going to try to portray that individual as heartless, slow, as what Kanye West famously said about George W. Bush, they don't care about black people or people of color or minorities in Puerto Rico or what have you. Isn't this a kind of a standard thing we would hear about just about any Republican president?
I don't know. I don't remember hearing that about George H.W. Bush, but what I do think is they will do that if they're given any material to work with. I thought the president was kidding when he said that. I didn't take that as some kind of an odd, bad moment for him. I thought there were other things that he said down there, kind of minimizing the death count, which is going to go up because of the aftermath, not so much because of the storm itself. and the fact that he didn't seem to exhibit a whole lot of empathy for the suffering down there. But that particular comment, I thought he did almost in jest. But yes, there's no doubt that there's a kind of caricature or trope about Republican presidents not caring about minorities or poor people. Sometimes Republican presidents walk right into that trap, just as there's a trope about Democratic presidents being big spenders and not caring about the budget. But Trump has given his opponents and critics a lot to work with, not necessarily on this trip, but certainly in the run-up to it, where he got totally sidelined and distracted by a silly feud that he initiated with the mayor of San Juan.
And the mayor of San Juan, one of President Trump's most vocal critics in all of this, was tweeting on her own today. She tweeted at one point, "Meeting with White House staff productive. They really understood the disconnect between how things are supposed to happen and how they really happen." And she added, "Hopefully the newly open channels of communication with White House staff will put in motion what is needed to accomplish our goal, save lives." Jonah, the president seemed to be saying that the mayor of San Juan was walking back her initial criticism, but it seems she only was complimentary here of the White House staff.
Yeah, again, my arm would be a lot more